Welcome to the Scholar's Chair. Our guest is Dr. Amina Wadud. Dr. Amina Wadud is a retired professor of Islamic studies and visiting research scholar at the Starr King School for the Ministry in Berkeley, California. She is the author of a book entitled Quran and Women Rereading the Sacred Text from a Woman's Perspective, and another book entitled Inside the Gender Jihad Women's Reform in Islam. Tonight, at Focus, the Quran and Human Equality is the title of our discussion. Here, in the Scholar's Chair, is Dr. Amina Wadud. Thank you for accepting our invitation to the Scholar's Chair. My first question, Dr. Wadud, is what is the Holy Quran for Muslims?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. I begin, as I always begin, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. Thank you, brother, for inviting me. I need to say that your first name is my son's first name, so I hope you don't mind if I call you by that.
That's fine.
The whole process of human creation has many mysteries, and we have tried to resolve it in many different ways. One of the most interesting mysteries to me is the idea that we are created by a single creator who wishes for our good and at the same time puts us here on this planet where there are many challenges, and along the way gives another kind of assistance in the form of revelation. That is, Allah speaks specifically to select servants along the way, and the speech is not limited to that servant, although Allah also speaks for personal reasons, as we know from the Quran. So the Quran is an example of God's speech to humankind. Specifically, this one was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace, from 7th century Arabia, providing what is called guidance. For some people, guidance is very literal and very point by point. For other people, guidance is sort of like in Eastern traditions when they talk about the way. It points us in a direction towards the claiming and the affirmation of our own potential goodness. In particular, the Quran is about 6,000 plus verses, covering many topics, making some important mandates, but not in the sense of rules, more in the sense of principles. It also tells stories, amazing stories. There's even humor. And so in a way, it remains both a mystery and an assistance in the journey of being human.
Excellent, excellent. So tell me about the idea that the Quran speaks to human equality. In your estimate, does it do that? Does the Quran say, well, tell us, what does the Quran say about human equality?
It's interesting when we look at equality, sometimes we only express it from the perspective of sort of the Western development of the United Nations and the Declaration of Human Rights that proceeded from that. Mm-hmm. But actually, equality is more a state of being that involves not only your relationship with your creator, but also, more importantly, your relationship with others created by that creator or humankind. So there is a reciprocal understanding of equality, and at the same time, complexities of human relationships sometimes makes it difficult for us to see how this might be put into operation. So I like to point at certain Quranic principles like dignity. The Quran says, لَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي Adam. All of the descendants of the original person, Adam, we have given karama or dignity. So in that sense, every human being is born with dignity. But because we have lived in systems where people have been oppressed, or where people have been sidelined in terms of their achievement of their full human dignity in institutions like slavery, or in ways of being like patriarchy, we have to assert again and again what the Quran means by equality, and we have to make sure that it's practical. In other words, we have to put it into practice. So while I think that the Quran affirms the equality and the dignity of every person and how every person is due justice, I am not at all afraid to say that as the Quran was revealed in a specific context, there were certain institutions like slavery that existed that the Quran spoke about only to confirm dignity in the practice, but not in a way to specifically eradicate the practice, which with our sentiment today is something that is just not acceptable. So in this way, I think that the Quran is a living text because we continue to interact with it, but also that the Quran interacts with our lives, with our lived realities in such a way that we meet the challenge of the notion of dignity, while at the same time we're grappling with it with the dynamics on the ground. So in my estimation, the Quran is totally anti any form of oppression, and sometimes oppressions change, sometimes they shift. And yet and still, I think it's categorically against that, and therefore I find it liberatory, and I find that its affirmation of the dignity that is universal, an indication that it means that all humans are equal to other humans.
The interesting thing I find about the Quran is that it speaks to us eternally, and I think that it speaks to us universally. I was curious about your idea of what I wanted to get an answer to the question. What Quranic principle mostly speak to Muslims today?
What Quranic? I missed the key word.
What Quranic principle or principles that mostly speak to Muslims today?
I think the two main principles in terms of especially human dignity, in terms of the human being, are the principles of justice and the principles of dignity. Justice also is not a static reality. It's a reality that is implemented in specific context. Mm-hmm. For us today, justice includes equality and reciprocity. But that wasn't always the case. Sometimes we were operating out of sort of the Greco-Roman understanding of equality as everybody has their place and everybody should get what they deserve in that place. Whereas today we're challenging the idea that there are certain placements of people by race or gender or sexual orientation, class or religion or citizenship or that kind of thing. That was the sort of old understanding of justice. The new understanding of justice is one of reciprocity. And so if you align that notion of justice with the concept of karama or dignity, as is also espoused in the Quran, again, we see that it's a dynamic thing because you cannot determine what is just for another person, nor can you determine what is dignity for another person unless that person also has a right to speak and to experience and to express through speech what is their experience. So it's dynamic. It is heavily engaged with, as humans benefit from something like revelation from a divine source.
Interesting. Freedom, justice, equality, huh?
Yes.
Yes, interesting. I tell you, that is very stimulating. What does the Quran say specifically about human equality? I guess I would just stay in that topic.
Okay, so Islam is built upon the notion of one God. Yes. The term for that in Arabic is Tawheed, Tawhid. But Tawheed comes from the second form of the verb, which is emphatic. So I like to use it as Allah creates equality and reciprocity. That it's it's a dynamic process. And so I've been working on something that I actually call the Tawhidic paradigm, because I have taken this emphatic idea about Tawheed, meaning that if we believe in one God, then we must also believe that we are on a relationship of horizontal reciprocity with all who have been created by God. And none of us can be above another. The only one that is above is Allah, the Creator, because Allah is not like humans. The Quran says, "Laysa kamithlihi shay'un." He's not like shay'un. He's not like things. He is transcendent. He's also intimate, and even in that way, it is a unique kind of reality. So the Tawhidi paradigm reminds us to use the inspiration that we get from our belief in the single Creator as Muslims as a motivation for eradicating all forms of injustice and oppression and inequality in our actions, our laws, our policies, our culture, our homes, etc.
Yes, yes.
So for me, it's not so much that the Quran talks about equality in the way in which, again, we perceive of it, sort of through the Western, sort of modern and liberal, sort of intellectual and spiritual, way of being, but more that fundamentally, I cannot be better than another human being. I can do better than myself. And doing better than myself means I'm only measuring myself against myself, and I aspire to that through what the Quran calls taqwa. And taqwa is usually translated as piety, but it's a kind of consciousness. It is a continual awareness that that one God is always present and sees us no matter where we are. And therefore, we make all of our actions as if they are transparent. And so it's, again, it's an active, it's a dynamic kind of thing. And so where equality might sometimes get to be elusive, what exactly does it mean? For example, working on gender, we have determined that the category of substantive equality does not mean that everybody starts the race at the same place. And yet at the same time, everyone has a right to arriving at the goal. And the goal, again, is return to our Lord. So we need to make sure that we smooth the path in such a way that impediments to persons arriving at their goal, achieving their full humanity before God, that those impediments are removed. So this means that we take into consideration differently abled bodies, different orientations, different genders, different classes, different races, and the like. And we work with systems. We work to create laws and policies that will eradicate inequalities and that will confirm justice and equality. So it's very dynamic. It's not like, okay, well, Allah gives you equality and then that's that. No, you have to work with Allah, with the guidance, with yourself, with the communities, with humanity at large, on this planet Earth to make sure that equality is realized in individual and collective lives.
So we have to keep reading and stuff, right?
Well, I think it's interesting because I'm a little bit of a geek, so I really value knowledge.
Sure.
And I also believe that knowledge is ongoing. I believe, again, according to the Quran, وَلَا يُحِيطُونَ بِشَيْءٍ مِنْ عِلْمِهِ إِلَّا بِمَا شَاءَ, that we would not encompass aught of the knowledge of the Creator, the grand knower, except by Allah's will. So I see that we have a responsibility for learning. Obviously, the Prophet, upon him be peace, said, seek knowledge from the cradle to the grave, or that seeking knowledge is incumbent upon every believer, male or female. So we have enough affirmation that learning, knowing, creating new knowledge is an important part of us fulfilling our obligations as human beings. So I kind of think that my geekness is in my favor, but I find, as the mother of 5 children, that sometimes you have to push people.
I quite agree. As a grandparent, I'm there doing it with you. Tell me, what is hadith? I know it's a source of knowledge for Muslims, but what is it exactly?
Okay, so when Allah chooses specific persons to take the responsibility of this kind of grand revelation, remember I said that there are revelations that are personal. So for example, Mary, the mother of Jesus, when she was pregnant, she received revelation, about her child and even about her labor. Again, the mother of Moses, when she was inspired to put her baby into a basket to float down the river, she was a nursing mother, and she received revelation to say, number one, put the child in the basket. Number two, we will keep the child safe. And number three, we will return the child to you. So in the Quranic version, she gets to become the wet nurse for the Pharaoh for her own baby. So those are wahi also, those are revelation. But the grand scheme revelation was given to specific persons because they were not left alone with, well, this message is just for me and nobody else needs to know. And in fact, if other people knew, it would have been dangerous for Moses, upon him be peace. So when the person to whom the Quran was revealed, that is the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, upon him be peace, when it was revealed to him, he fulfilled the mandate that goes along with this gift as the receiver. And that is not just you keep it to yourself, but you also share it with others. That is, you must deliver the message, you must announce it, you must make it known, and you must live as an exemplar of this message. So that meant that the prophet's responsibility to embody this message in his actions was also recognized not only by his immediate community and companions, but historically as another example of guidance and another way for us to seek and understand the truth. So hadith, a hadith in the plural, is actually the speech of the prophet, haddatha, to state, to mention. And these were collected historically. There was a process in terms of the history of the collection and the safeguarding of the hadith. And it took a good 150 years before it kind of fell into a pattern. But at least there was a rigor in trying to ascertain after the fact, did this really come from the prophet? So they marked not only what the statement was, so for example, Talabat al-ilm faridatan ala kulli muslim wa muslima, seeking of knowledge is a requirement on every Muslim male and female, is one of the hadith, that's the content. Well, how did we get that one? So we have to go back in time, which collectors started doing about 100 years after the prophet, and double checking, well, who was this person? Was this a reliable person? Did they have a good memory? Did they themselves have exemplary behavior? So they collected information not only about what the statement was from the prophet, upon him be peace, but also how we got it, and they compiled all of this into what's known as the science of hadith. So it's rigorous. There are, at least 7 major collections of those that are considered to be sound or authoritative, but they also collected ones that were not sound, that were weak, or that had broken chains of transmission, or that was questionable in various ways. So there's a lot of hadith material, and because the prophet was a human being and lived amongst human beings, having a very human experience, they cover areas that sometimes are not covered in detail in the Quran, and as such, they become what we call the second divine source of how to be Muslim, how to do Islam.
Excellent. Tell me, what is the hadith guidance in our subject, human equality? I think you've mentioned a couple of them along our conversation already. But I would hope that you would even expound upon them.
My favorite one is a hadith of the Prophet that says, "La yu'minu ahadukum hatta yuhibbu li akhihi hatta yuhibba li akhihi ma yuhibbu li nafsihi." And I'm going to give a gender-inclusive translation, and we'll worry about the rest of it at another time.
Please,
and it basically says, one of you cannot claim to be a believer. One of you does not believe until he or she loves for another what they love for themselves. So again, you see it's reciprocity in action. If you don't want someone to oppress you, to put your children into slavery and bondage, then do not put other people's children in slavery or bondage or oppress other people. It uses, again, the self, that is the one being that we know when we wake up every day that we are present with is our own being. It uses the self as a rubric for determining the necessity for actions with regard to an other that is measured by one's own self. So, you know, you do for others as you would do for self.
Yes.
And this is a kind of philosophical location that has been articulated in many faith traditions and many philosophical systems. So that's actually my favorite hadith.
Alhamdulillah. How does, and I have to get to the gender part of your work actually. How does the female experience inform our understanding of the Quran?
So we are told by the Quran that the creation of male and female is a part of the divine design.
Yes.
I also do a lot of stuff with regard to, you know, what's called cosmology. In other words, the creation story in the Quran, but, you know, I won't distract from it. Simply to say that we basically conceive of the human community as an affirmation of these two gender. And again, those two genders are not fixed. Those are constructs. But what I learned in the earliest part of my study as a Muslim, I've been a Muslim for almost 50 years, what I learned was that the voice and experience of women were removed from the discourse that created what we consider to be the foundation or fundamentals of Islam. And this was during the Abbasid period. Mm-hmm. So where the Prophet affirmed the agency and spiritual equality of women in his mission, and where the Quran does likewise, the history of Islam and Muslims did not keep pace. They fell back into the existing patriarchal structures and paradigms that existed for everybody. It wasn't unique to Muslims, but the ways in which it manifests, we're still grappling with, because it was so early in our intellectual and spiritual development that sometimes the patriarchy is encoded with the transmission of those fundamental principles. Like the hadith that I mentioned before, it was quite common for the Prophet to speak to only men. And so the language of it is, one of you, does not believe until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself. And I've just universalized it because his wife, Salama, said, I don't understand why, Allah is always referring to men. We're here also. And the Quran revealed in Surah 33, Surah Ahzab, there's a statement about believing women and believing men, and fasting women and fasting men, and praying women and praying men, and conscientious women and conscientious men. In other words, yes, we mean all of you who are striving towards Allah. So the mandate for the maintaining of the equality between them as both orators and creators of Islam and Islamic traditions fell into the vicissitudes of history. And we have recently, and when I say recently, I mean literally, in the 20th century, there's been a stronger push to correct some of the ways in which the imbalance sometimes is taken literally rather than taken metaphorically. So my favorite hadith, as I said, it's spoken of only in male language, but it's still my favorite because I realized that the Prophet was speaking to his audience in universal terms, but the culture was still divided in such a way that not only did Salama said, why does the Quran, refer to men so much? She also said, we need a day, just us women with you, because we have questions we want to ask, and we don't always want to ask them in front of men, especially strange men. So they were given a day. So in other words, the efforts at making that inclusion were there, but we just didn't maintain them historically. So we've been doing catch up. We've been trying to make it understandable that women's experiences with Islam, with the Quran, with the Prophet upon him be peace, with Allah, are an important part of the articulation of Islam, of the Quran, of Allah, and of the Prophet. And yet the record is not sufficient for us to surmise that.
Yeah.
So we've been working at ways in which we assert that women's lived realities are markers for the extent to which that text fulfills its own goal, say, of guidance or justice.
Well,
we measure justice to women by women. Somebody outside cannot tell you if something is just. You have to be able to experience it and then articulate it for yourself. So women's voices matter, women's experiences matter, and it's important for us to enter those into the ways in which we see Islam.
Fascinating. This would be helpful for men, yes?
Yes, because we are sharing this journey, and it is a journey, and there are challenges, and we need to be able to fight together to achieve the best that we can achieve. We don't need to leave anybody behind. If you take, for example, the Quranic discussion about Mary when she was in labor, where do you think you're going to get information to fully understand what that discussion is, except for people who labor? Well, that would be women. So we just enhance the experience of Islam and our human experience and our capacity to return to Allah in peace and justice.
Alhamdulillah. Tell us more about gender equality. More than that, I want to know what stimulated you to approach the Quran in hopes of finding and discovering gender equality?
My Islam by choice, that is, I came from a Christian background. My father was a Methodist minister. And I kept studying world religions. And in fact, I was also a Buddhist. But my entry into Islam, the day that I took my Shahada was Thanksgiving Day. And then I went back to my college campus. I was an undergraduate and started doing more reading. But it took me 4 or 5 months before I came across the Quran. Now, in my estimation, that should have happened a different way. Maybe Allah was testing me to see if I would hang in there. But honestly, when I came across the Quran just in English translation, one that I do not even use today, I fell in love. I've been in love ever since. And I'm really fortunate because sometimes people have a different kind of experience, and I acknowledge that and I understand even why that may be. I fell in love with the Quran. I fell in love with this. Maybe it was my background, because I loved my father, and he was a minister and he was always talking about God. But I love this idea of God's speech being direct, whereas in the compilation of the Gospels, it's not God's speech direct. It is the report of others, Paul and John and etc. I love this direct communication. And I also loved, as I said, the world view that was being expressed. And I love, the humor, the beauty of nature. That's just, I just was in love. So from the moment that I got it, I decided I would clear the path between myself and comprehension of this text. And in the next semester, I began my study of Arabic, which went on for 10 years, including twice living in Arabic-speaking countries. Because again, the Quran's in Arabic. If I want to understand it, I need to know Arabic, and specifically, I need to know Quranic Arabic. So when I came through these various hurdles with regard to the Quran, I did not perceive of myself in any way, shape, or form as being unequal because of my gender. I grew up in the civil rights movement. My father took me to the March on Washington with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. So I knew the fight for racial equality intimately. I didn't know the fight for gender equality. I kind of missed the waves of feminism that, kind of happened because I had become Muslim at such an early age. I was immersed in trying to understand this. But I did perceive that the worldview as espoused by the Quran, which is absolutely gender, egalitarian, was not the basis of the way Muslims live their lives. And that Muslims were living their lives in accordance to a number of factors, and Islam was one of them, but there were other factors: culture, history, class. So it came to my mind that I needed to, so the subtitle of my first book is Rereading the Sacred Text
Yes.
from a Woman's Perspective.
Yes.
It occurred to me that sometimes people think just because you know a language, know a word, that everybody who knows that language and knows that word understands them exactly the same way. They don't. So it occurred to me that we simply needed to reaffirm the presence of the female voice in the Quran and the presence of God's speech for women as fully as God's speech for men, because that was not our history. So when I started the project, I did not have revolution on my mind.
Yes.
I was still in the throng of the love affair that I was having with the Quran. And yet, as I encountered more teachers and read more text, I said, oh my God, they're all men. So we have no record of women's responses to the Quran until the middle part of the 20th century.
I see.
And I thought to myself, we might just be missing something. And sure enough, we were.
Aisha? Aisha, there's many accounts of Aisha's hadith or sayings of the Prophet.
Yes, so we distinguish between the hadith and the Quran. One is revelation from God, and one is speech from the Prophet.
Yes.
And we also, in discipline terms, we distinguish the field of knowledge to which Aisha radiallahu anha made a contribution. And so she's used in the areas of what they call fiqh or usul of fiqh, which is the legal or juridical traditions and the rules for their understanding. She made contributions in those areas, and she also made contributions, as you say, in the area of hadith and hadith collections, because she said things that she experienced with the Prophet that other people had not, and she also said things that she experienced with the Prophet that others had, so she becomes an authoritative source.
Yes.
She did not make comments on the Quran. We don't have even that much of a record of comments made by the Prophet, upon him be peace, with regard to the Quran. We have some. In other words, the Quran, the Prophet didn't do tafsir, which is the field of knowledge that says, help us to clarify, fassara, to clarify the meanings of these. And clarification of meaning means, how do we put it into application? How do we make this worldview present? So the Prophet lived tafsir. His body and his actions and his speech was tafsir. It was clarification. But we don't have that many comments. But the field of tafsir began very early, in fact, before even hadith sciences, because people were always saying, even in the lifetime of the Prophet, well, what does this mean? You know, Allah says, aqim as-salat, establish, take control of, be responsible for prayer. Well, what does that mean? So asking, what does it mean? And then people elucidating for the record, what does it mean? That's tafsir. It's not hadith, it's not sunnah, it's not shari'ah or law, and it's not history, although I would say there's a solid historical element to it. So tafsir as a science, the discipline of Quranic interpretation, is huge. It's huge, it's massive. It's intricate. It's beautiful. I mean, you know, I was again blessed with this field, and I love it. And yet, only in the middle part of the previous century did we start to have a record about women, and that was from a woman who was in Egypt named Aisha Abdurrahman, Bint Rahman.
This is excellent.
So it's a field of study, the impact of which is, in my mind, unlimited. I take my work as a theologian and as a Quranic scholar, I take my work into activism on the basis of gender and sexuality. So the Quran motivates me for my life and for the work that I do, my, you know, Black Lives Matter, you know, anti-oppression work. I'm inspired by the Quran. But the field of studying the Quran and understanding the Quran, it's sort of the second tier of the fact that we all read the Quran. Most of us learn a little bit of the Quran so we can at least perform our prayers. or we have few statements that come from it. Everybody says, mashallah, alhamdulillah. Of course, those all come from the Quran. But understanding the nuances of how the Quran makes certain compositions, first of all, to me, it's also an ongoing experience. Every Ramadan, I try to read through the Quran. It's what's happening in the last years since I turned in my 60s. I get about halfway through. So sometimes the next year I just start in the middle because I didn't get all the way through. But I try to read it ritualistically every Ramadan. And every time something new appears to me, despite the fact that I've spent years on the study of this and I've written books. So it reveals itself to us in continuation of our experience with it. So in my estimation, you know, understanding the Quran is an ongoing process and will continue to go on as long as we understand that we, you know, need that interpretive interaction in order for us to be able to grapple with the grand nature of this particular text.
You're informing us that this is an evolutionary process. This is not something that you are going to get to tonight or tomorrow night. My dear sister,
and many people memorize the Quran, yes, because again, this is another field that we have developed and we've maintained, you know, from the time that the Prophet made a point of it himself. People memorize the Quran without necessarily being, you know, mufassir. They cannot do interpretation. Yes. And people memorize it from different language groups. They are Urdu speaking, they're English speaking, they're, you know, Indonesian Bahasa speaking. They memorize the same Quran, but that does not necessarily equate to being qualified to be able to talk about the interpretation. And interpretation it's a hermeneutical process. Yes. It's about meaning.
I have found people who are hafiz, and they will give the khutbah to the imam for that very same purpose that you just mentioned, because they can recite it, but they can't teach it, and they don't know its meaning. And I found that
meaning to me is the most amazing part. Yeah. It's the whole idea that I could be excited about literally with a translation that today I cannot stand. I cannot stand at all what I was first given, and yet it was only that translation that inspired me for the lifetime career and trajectory of my soul. So, you know, it's, yeah.
Tell me something. What does the Quran say about human purpose? What is your view of the Quran's guidance concerning the human purpose?
Concerning, I still missed the key word.
Concerning the human purpose.
Human purpose.
What is the purpose of humanity?
Yes. So the Quran says, "Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa." Indeed, I will create on the earth an agent, a moral agent. It's a particular kind of agent, this khalifa, because it is one who stands in the place of Allah, him or herself, in order to fulfill the mandate of a good life on this earth. We're caretakers. We aspire to, people say, fulfill the divine purpose or the divine will, but often people say to fulfill the divine will is just like the do's and don'ts, the yes and no's, the halal and haram. But actually the divine purpose is present in everything in the universe, and that is harmony and beauty. So the human purpose is to fulfill divine beauty on the earth. And that is a huge task. Takes you a whole lifetime.
Your whole lifetime. Yes, I would consider that to be the joy of the work. I agree with that.
I would too.
Tell me about the Ummah, the principles of the Ummah. I had just finished a scholars chair on that. I actually had two scholars sitting down for an hour discussing this principle. And I should have invited you to by Zoom. Tell me, what is the Ummah and what does it mean to us in today's struggle for clarity? And
So the word ummah, as you probably already know, comes from the root form that is the same as the word mother.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever used the phrase, my brother from another mother or something like
No,
that.
I never did that.
I say it all the time about, Muslim companions along the way who happen to be male. They're my brother, they're from another mother kind of thing.
Sure.
So it is the idea that fundamentally all humanity is related. And using the image of the not the rahim, the womb itself, which of course is the root form of the word ar-Rahman and Rahim, but understanding that at a fundamental level, we all descend from the first person, Adam, upon him be peace. And therefore, in no distant terms, we are all related. I like to say, all of us make it or none of us make it. That's the reality. And with COVID, we've come to understand that a little bit better, I think. A lot of people are not willing to surrender to this message, but the reality is we're all in this together. In the context of the evolution of the use of the term ummah amongst Muslims, it came to mean the Muslim brotherhood or familyhood, if you will. And eventually, it began to stand for the community with a capital T, the community. I just went over this in an interview that I did with another group, about 2 weeks ago. The problem is that when we conceive of the community, we conceive of that community in very fixed and closed terms. Some are in and some are out. Yes, some people understand their identity as Muslims, and some people strive for the achievement of that caretaking of the earth because of the divine will to achieve beauty and harmony and justice and equality and dignity. Some people, use ummah in specific terms, but I'm not one of those people, actually. I think that first of all, Muslims themselves have spread to every corner of the earth. They are in all places as minorities or majorities, and they are not the same. The whole idea that, say, a Nigerian reflection of the Islamic principles of compassion or mercy would manifest in accordance to the culture of Nigeria does not make it less valid than somebody coming, from Mecca in Saudi Arabia or, other parts of Muslim majority context. So in other words, communities reflect the mandate of the responsibility of being human, being, one who is servant of Allah, fulfilling the divine decree on the earth. They reflect it in a multiplicity of ways. And it's important to allow for that diversity, because I think this is one of the biggest challenges of our day. How do we deal with people who are different from us? Do we close them out of our notion of ummah, or do we open up our notion of ummah? So I'm for the opening up of the notion of ummah, and I'm for the retaining of it as a term that expresses relationship, intimate relationships, so that I care about your family and the experiences that you're having with COVID, and I care about my family and the experiences that we're having with COVID. But I don't remove your humanity because you decide, oh, well, I don't want to wear a mask. I may not agree with you because I think it makes a difference, but at least I would say, well, this is a human being that I don't agree with, and I would retain your humanity and disagree with you. Yes. Well, for some people, when you disagree, that means they're out. That's sorry, I'm just going to shoot them. They're not wearing a mask, boom, So we have to really work at what it means to be a member of the human community, and at the same time, what that primary responsibility it is in being human, and that is to live justice, equality, dignity, harmony, beauty for ourselves and for others. And I'm sure none of your speakers on Ummah said anything like that.
Oh, I am certain of that. It was some overlapping matters, but yours we got to a specific point. Thank you for that. I wanted to, you know, something, I don't want to abuse our first relationship. We're at 40 minutes or 42 minutes, and I wanted to just tell you how much I valued this exchange. I'm praying Allah, and we need more time, I know that, but I'm praying Allah bless us to do that. Tell me, if a student is in your class and he asks or she asks you about a book that might be of some benefit for further learning, what book would you recommend?
That book would be the Quran.
Yes, yes, of course.
It's a funny kind of thing. I'll tell you a joke and then I'll tell you a serious part of it. When I was in graduate school, a friend of mine called me up and she says, "Do you have the best book?" And I said, "You mean the Quran?" And she meant the best catalog book from the company called Best.
Yes.
That's my default. But seriously, we don't read the Quran. We read the commentary and we read the community and we read the culture and we read the history. If you strip away, if you just take a nice translation of the Quran and just read that for 1 year, as far as like, oh, I want to know more about Islam, you will solidify a depth with regard to Islam that you can't get from any other source. So for me, because I'm a geek and I'm a retired professor, the book lists are very long. But if you ask me for a single book, it's got to be the Quran. If I was on an island and I could only have one book, it would be my Quran, you know? And yet, as a commentator myself, I do want people to, you know, engage in the commentary, but learn how to read it without the commentary, because when you add your comprehension, when you is sort of infused by the comprehension of the person who's doing the commentary, and you may not agree with it. In fact, that's one of the first ways that I realized I needed to study gender. I disagreed with my instructor, my professor. So reading the Quran for just the Quran is really an amazing experience.
Tell me, where do you get such confidence in the human being's ability to make this translation possible and to have this intimate relationship with God's word and get it right?
Yes, well, you know, I guess, you know, the former First Lady, Mrs. Michelle Obama, inspired me to keep hope alive in a way that, you know, is really different from what we're seeing out there. Certainly, I feel despair. I was just recently reading about her feeling, you know, sort of low-grade depression. Certainly, you know, I experienced despair, and I think the struggle is real. But I really have to keep hope alive because, again, we all make it or none of us make it. So I'm not here for just whatever is my satisfaction, because I've had a blessed life. I've been fortunate. I've been to more than 60 countries. I lived in 6. I know several languages. I have friends, like really, really good friends all over the world. So yes, I've had a very blessed life. But I cannot give up on humanity because I'm a human being. And I don't want anybody to give up on me on the moments that I'm failing. So I do keep hope alive. But, you know, the word is out. I'm pretty radical, and I definitely, you know, I'm not really good with bullshit. So, you know, so I mean, when you start with my favorite book, the Quran, and you ask me about things, I'm always in a very hopeful place, really.
Because of the Quran's insistence on a few things, including that there is no coercion in religion, and that goes to sects as well as other religions. So now we're talking about Islam as it's revealed in the Quran, not as some authoritarian people practice it.
Tell me, what is this concept that you're putting forward? What is religious tribalism?
Well, both words are controversial. I mean, religion can have many different meanings. It can mean that you're very narrow-minded and you don't recognize the validity of anybody else. Tribalism can mean exactly the same thing. When you have both of them together, you have something that's a real problem. There are 3 levels of religious tribalism. One I call tolerance. Tolerance means I won't kill you yet. Diversity means I can't stand you, but you're here, and there's nothing I can do about it. Pluralism, which means we welcome you because we each have so much to offer each other. In America, we claim that we are at the level of pluralism, but there have been books written on this subject indicating that we are always at least one stage ahead. We think we're one stage ahead of where we are.
Yes, yes.
The major intellectual challenge for Islamic scholars throughout their history has been to develop from the Islamic scriptures and from the ethical teachings of all civilizations a framework of moral guidance to secure compassionate justice. This framework is entitled the Maqasid al-Shari'ah, or the purposes of Islamic law. The underlying purpose is respect for all of God's creation, and especially the human being, and further, respect for religious freedom.
Religious freedom is a value that's very dear to my heart. Yeah. Religious freedom is important to me because after I finish translating the Quran, I had to sit down like a couple of months later and think, what is this book trying to tell me? I found out that the essence of the Quran is freedom. I have a choice whether I want to believe there is a creator, whether I want to worship that creator, whether I want to obey that creator. All this is based on my free choice. Yes. So I guess when I have freedom, I can make the choice and worship God. But when freedom is absent, when I'm forced to do things, even when I'm forced to do all the good things that I'm supposed to do, they don't count. Yes. They didn't come with my free will. So the essence of Quran is freedom. If the essence of the Quran is freedom, freedom should be the main value of our constitution. Any constitution, whether you call it shari'ah, whether you call it constitution, whatever you call the law that organize the relation of people to each other. Freedom should be the essence of that. And justice should be immediately coming out of that freedom. Because without justice, freedom becomes chaos.
The love of God and the neighbor are essential roles in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The role of respect in the Islamic scriptures for followers of the Abrahamic religions, including Muslims as well as Jews and Christians, can be brought out by citing three basic principles emphasized throughout the Quran. The three principles which are pervasive throughout the Quran are freedom of religion, which includes equality in human dignity, unity in diversity, universal conditions for salvation, and equality of the prophets. 2 is love, which includes one's personal relationship with God, forgiveness, and peaceful reconciliation. And 3, compassionate justice, which includes personal righteousness and normative law. Together, these three lead to respect for Jews and Christians and to acceptance of them as fellow peoples of the book.
Is there support in the Holy Quran for the free will of the human being, humanity?
Yeah, I think there is. There's a lot of confusion about this because the Quran correctly says, everything is by God's will. Mm-hmm. And so on a simple reading, one would say, well, then I guess there's no human will because God's will trumps everything. Mm-hmm. But a closer reading of the Quran makes it clear that it is God's will that he should give human beings the ability to choose. Mm-hmm. That is his will. And that is why in a passage that actually Dr. Crane quotes, although I'm not sure I exactly 100% agree with his interpretation, but there is a passage that he quotes that it says to the Prophet basically, are you going to, how are you going to force them to believe if God has allowed them not to believe?
Yes.
I think it's a misreading to read this as some might say, well, God made them to misbelieve. That's not what it says at all. It says God has allowed them to choose. And if God has allowed them to choose, the prophet has no say in the matter as to whether he can only preach. And if the prophet can only preach, then how can we do anything more than to vocalize our point of view and try to persuade?
So what is human freedom in relationship to a state?
The problem with a state, Muslims particularly, many Muslims like to talk about an Islamic state.
Yes.
What they mean is an Islamic polity or an Islamic society, an Islamic community, which is united in worship of God and in translating the scriptures and natural law and human reason into principles of justice and the practice of justice. The concept of state, however, in Western thought, political thought, is quite different. It didn't exist anywhere in the world until basically 400 years ago. In 1638, the Lutherans and the Catholics finally ended their 30 years war in Europe, all over Europe, by deciding that there is no higher authority. Each claimed they were representing Christianity, and there is no higher authority at the transcendent level beyond human will.
Yes.
And therefore, they said, we are now states, and a state by definition is the ultimate source of truth, the ultimate authority. It is also by definition the only source of legitimate coercion.
And that would certainly be in contradiction to the Islamic idea that there be no compulsion, no compulsion in religion. So
yes, well, that's why an Islamic state, using the Western definition of state, is an oxymoron.
Freedom of religion, equality in human dignity. Immediately following the throne verse, this is the most beautiful verse describing the attributes of God. In the second surah, Surah Al-Baqarah, in verse 257, it states simply, "Let there be no compulsion in religion." This is axiomatic because ultimate and absolute truth does exist, and it is the human instinct to seek it. But no person or community can know more than a portion of this truth. Certainly no one could claim to possess it to the exclusion of others, because this would be the same as claiming to be God.
So this is why religious freedom is very important to me. People should be able to choose who they worship freely.
The Prophet Muhammad, may God's peace be with the Prophet, was specifically ordered to treat all people equally regardless of their religion. Shortly after the throne verse, we find Surah 2, verse 272, which reads, "It is not for you, O Prophet, to bring people to the path of right guidance, since it is God alone who guides whom he will." The circumstance of this revelation was the prophet's advice to his companion to give charity only to his followers in Medina who were poor. This revelation came immediately, whereupon the prophet enjoined his followers to disperse charity based on personal need without regard to religion.
One of the other names for the Quran is the conclusive argument. And Allah says about the Quran that in the Quran you find the arguments that hit home. You know, it's one of the translations. And there's an ayat I like to read in the Quran that says, "O mankind, indeed we have created you from a male and a female and made you peoples and tribes that you may know one another. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the one with the most taqwa, or God consciousness. Indeed, Allah is knowing and acquainted." And that ayat or verse is an ayat that's read in a lot of interfaith discussions, and I think it really kind of goes to the heart of the underlying principle of mutual respect, as Allah sort of very pointedly explains in the Quran, that as we get to know each other and evaluate our relationship to those things that we hold dear and guard and preserve and protect with our relationship to Allah, to God, then we can kind of see the similarities in each other, and we get to know one another better and to appreciate each other better and more fully, knowing that Allah has created this diversity in the first place.
Freedom of religion means freedom for all persons to be treated equally in dignity as human beings.